Hello and welcome to the Gaggle, where we challenge and, if necessary, destroy media narratives. I'm George Szamuely. With me today, of course, is co-founder of the Gaggle, Peter Lavelle, host also of RT's talk show, Crosstalk. Well, it's time for the mailbag, and the mailman has brought in a bumper bag for us to examine. We've got a lot of very interesting comments and questions that we'd love to answer. And so let's get down to it right away. So first question is from Quantum Rome, who's a frequent contributor. And it's very interesting. He says here, the late Stephen F. Cohen, regarded as the most respectable scholar of the subject of Soviet-Russian history, always demonstrated his deep regard for Gorbachev, for undertaking, quote, the most ambitious changes in modern history, unquote. Cohen praised Gorbachev's goal to dismantle the state control Stalin imposed and to achieve an, quote, emancipation of society, unquote, through privatization, democratization, federalization of the 15 republics. Cohen insisted that thanks to Gorby, Russia has come closer to democracy than ever before, though democratization remains exceedingly fragile. So how can this be dismissed as a failure? This is a quote from Cohen. And then Quantum Rome goes on. Meanwhile, the general sentiment in Russia regarding Gorby goes along the lines expressed by military analyst A. Martyanov, quote, cowardly, very narrow-minded and hollow. He is certainly one of the most outstanding, and here there's a very, very rude word, in history, who managed to destroy his country. Granted, it needed some changes, but who became an embodiment of human incompetence, unquote. How do you explain this discrepancy in perception within Russia and outside of it? And what is your opinion of the first and only Soviet president? All right, well,
you want to take a crack at it, George? Go ahead.
Well, there's a lot there to chew on. So
yeah, that's a whole podcast right there.
Podcast
it's a pretty good question.
Okay, but why don't you start?
Well, I met Stephen Cohen a number of times before his death, and I fundamentally disagreed with his position on Gorbachev, and I still do. The general that you mentioned, I'm much more preferential to his position. The problem is, in the way I talked about it with Stephen, is that Gorbachev was an apparatchik. He knew how to climb up a power structure, but he didn't know much more than that, okay? And he was good at that, but those are not the skills you need to transform a country. And I mean, at the end of the day, he wasn't a particularly competent person. And, does that mean he was a person of goodwill? Yeah, why not? I think he was a person of goodwill, but he didn't have the vision. He didn't have the tools and a vision of doing things differently because, I've always thought, and a lot of people disagree with me, is that perestroika was what was needed, not glasnost. You can worry about that later. Rearrange the economy, unleash the entrepreneurship, get the state can stay in the commanding heights. I have no problem with that. Electricity, grid, water, yeah, okay. But baby food and toys, and so, Stephen and I would always talk about, and he was on my program a number of times, and I think one of the topics was Gorbachev. And, right. And it's interesting because in the West, there's people that claim to know something about Russia. They'll say it was Yeltsin versus Gorbachev. But if you ask the general public here, they say a plague on both their houses, okay? I mean, neither one of them are popular figures here. So it's not a binary here. And at the end of the day, Gorbachev failed, and he failed fundamentally, right. All right? And because of that failure, it opened up the possibility or the inevitability of someone like Vladimir Putin. There's so much here to chew on here, George.
Right, no, I think that's your analysis is spot on. I mean, I think he showed himself to be a very skilled political infighter, but he was not a visionary. So yes, it was amazing that he managed to outmaneuver all of his political rivals, but in the process, he lost his country. And you would have to say that the failure is of a staggering proportions. I mean, he inherits a country, a 15 republic union, a very formidable country. Number two is a military power in the world, feared by most of the world. And within 6 years, that state is no more. I mean, that is just a staggering failure. So you really have to start really from that premise that you really did bungle everything in allowing it to dissolve. But I think ultimately he really didn't have any sense of how he was going to achieve what he wanted. I mean, he began, making fundamental changes to the governance of the country, really, without really having a sense of where is all this going to go, and it very quickly collapsed. I mean, here he is. He has a referendum in March 1991.
There you go.
In which the people expressed their desire, overwhelming majority, to keep some form of a state going. And what happened to that referendum? None of that was, is implemented. The will of the majority was never implemented. So you'd have to say that he was an incompetent figure. And then you'd have to say, if you look at the model of the Chinese, and there's, we've had a lot of occasion to criticize China, many aspects of Chinese policy, but China managed to reform the system to make it productive and make China economically successful without actually dismantling the whole country. I mean, a Gorbachev in China would have probably ended up with the whole country just breaking up. So I'd say that he really, the Russians, I think, are right today to despise Gorbachev. He was not a good leader, and that's ultimately the judgment of history. He wasn't a good leader.
One of the interesting things is, I think it's important to point out is that when you think of the person of Gorbachev and his life and legacy, it's manufactured in the West.
Right.
Okay. It's a I mean, like Lech Wałęsa was very much manufactured in the West.
Yes.
And people in the West don't understand that, okay? Because Gorbachev was going to do what he was told to do. See, that's why they liked him so much, okay?
Yes. Yes.
And interestingly, I have to go back to our first point here, is that he was a Communist Party apparatchik. Now, you just mentioned the referendum, which I was going to do that myself. And so here we have a majority of the people of the Soviet Union and its constituted republics that wanted to maintain some kind of union. The problem with the union was the Communist Party, in which he was an apparatchik and they climbed to the top. Okay, that's why it's like oil and water. It just, you just couldn't mix it, okay? And he didn't really understand that. And if he did, it was way, way too late, because then you had someone like Yeltsin, which was a pure opportunist, okay? He was an apparatchik too, and he got as far as he could. And then he said, we're gonna play a new game now. I'm gonna go to the forest in Belarus. I'm gonna break up this thing and I'm gonna take my share.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that it does go to the heart of the Communist Party. This is a point that people like Zhirinovsky make, which is a kind of what Gorbachev and the communists did was a kind of last FU to Russia. That's all they've ever been doing, ever since Lenin seized power and abolished all the political parties, that they've just been doing a kind of FU to everyone. And this was it. This was just, that's it. Boom. We're just going to dissolve the state. And so that's, let's say without any real vision, that's it. Well, and it's gone. There was really almost no willingness to fight for the state, to resist the coming collapse. It should have been done. I mean, that's something that any skilled political leader would have been able to prevent this a complete collapse in this way. He didn't have that. I think ultimately he didn't even care that much.
Well, it gets down to political skill and vision, because on the back of the referendum, you've got the wind to your back. People want to keep this together, okay? So the political genius The world historic figure would have been, let's try this to keep us together. Right. And he didn't understand that. He didn't understand it at all. Right. So I don't want to be cruel towards Gorbachev, but I don't see him as a political success. Okay, no, and I mean, considering the long range of Russian history, he wasn't corrupt, which that's a card in his hand. Okay, he wasn't a corrupt person, but let's think about it today. I'm not trying to cast aspersions on anyone, but I mean, who helps him with his sustenance in life? Are Western think tanks? I mean, right. that would be kind of the ultimate ending.
Right, right. Well, and that's it. And then you ultimately also have to consider the state that he left the country in, because by giving up all of the hard-won military gains of the Soviet Union and the political influence that they exerted far into the West, and just giving it all up without getting anything in return, he put Russia in jeopardy. I mean, that's again reflects a very bad leader, that he puts his country into serious military jeopardy, because at least you could argue, okay, well, fine, we got rid of these various republics, and that's okay. We can live without, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and so on. Okay, maybe you could make that argument. You don't want to get yourself in a position where you've got a hostile military alliance surrounding you. That's history is going to be very cruel on you if you do that.
In his since he left power, one of the things that I truly lament and criticize him for is allowing the West to write the narrative of the end of the Cold War. Again, George and I have said repeatedly, and we will continue to insist, that the Soviet Union did not lose the Cold War, it opted out of the Cold War. Okay, and Gorbachev, I credit him for opting out. He just didn't take the next step, okay? Because you left yourself exposed, okay? You left Russia exposed, okay? I don't know what his feelings are about Russia one way or another, okay? But I mean, it's the Russians that have suffered the brunt of all of this, okay? So, his legacy is very complicated. And I can just tell you, it's like when tourists come and say, well, what do you think Gorbachev thinks about this? And I said, nobody cares what he thinks. Nobody here.
I think it's right. And that's right, because you can say, okay, there were plenty of leaders within the communist apparat, who thought that the Soviet Union needed changing. We had that already with Andropov, and that was the Gorbachev. But the problem was that they had to find, find some means of change without letting the country collapse in this way. And I think that when you once had a country, and now you don't have it anymore. And Russia ultimately is not it's not the same thing. I mean, Russia is still, it's a kind of middle of the road power, kind of a middleweight power. That was the Soviet Union. That was once a very serious player on the world stage, a very influential player on the world stage. When you think of its foreign policy, how it maneuvered the liberation movements, the Third World, a whole kind of anti-imperial struggle against the West. Very, very important, powerful player on the world stage. That's kind of gone. I mean, again, Gorbachev naively sort of accepted a lot of Western ideas, without really thinking about them sufficiently. And that is an excuse, because somebody who had reached the top should have been much more aware of what was what.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't it interesting, George, the person that made it on top? And I mean, we have to remember, there was the revolution, there was the Civil War, there was Stalin's stint, okay? And it wasn't much prettier under Gorbachev, okay? This is a tough and tumble world. I mean, this is to get on the top of that hill is pretty amazing. Yes. But at the end of the day, George, he didn't really fight for it. And the elite didn't either. They didn't either.
That's the amazing, you're absolutely right. That's the stunning thing. They didn't fight for it. I mean, it's like, and you felt like you didn't care. I mean, that state, you could tell already from the 1989 onwards, this state is collapsing, and you just didn't care. They didn't seem to do anything to fight against it. Just let it collapse.
And there are just countless stories of you had these apparatchiki that were head of the energy industry, the coal industry, I mean, big stuff, okay? And how they just watch right in front of their eyes, not aware, is that, hey, here's some people coming in, they're gonna strip this away from you, strip this, and then, we're gonna get a lawyer, we're gonna write this up, and and it's ours, and these people watching, and with their jaw wide open, how is this happening? They didn't stop it at all. And that's when we got the entire, the oligarchs took over vast swaths of the economy right in broad daylight, and there was no resistance to it. And then you had someone like Yeltsin who say, well, you can have more as long as you help me, okay? And then again, it created the seeds for someone like Vladimir Putin to put it all to a screeching halt.
Right. Well, Yeltsin's goal was just simply turn Russia into basically a colonial outpost for the Western powers. I mean, he was just saying, hey, what do you want? I'm going to give you everything, whatever it is. I mean, that was the policy. I mean, it's hard to know what exactly Gorbachev was thinking. I mean, it does seem like a man of naivete.
He wasn't.
Yeltsin wasn't naive. Yeltsin pursued his goals ruthlessly.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, he pursued his goals. I mean, it's kind of like Trump derangement syndrome, in the Russian example. If Gorbachev wants this, we want this. Right. It's like, that's not good politics. That's not good policy, okay? Right. I mean, neither one of them thought it out at all, okay? And it was just like, two bulldogs under the carpet fighting, I mean, and then when you're left, both of you are exhausted, and then you're completely open to being taken advantage of. Okay, and then there were all of those oligarchs that were willing to sell the country out for a dime.
Exactly, and Yeltsin was more than happy to oblige. He was just happy to give them whatever they want. I mean, it was a looting free for all. And Yeltsin did absolutely nothing.
Remember, everyone, when Yeltsin was running for re-election, who helped? I mean, it's exaggerated, but I mean, he brought in American advisors.
That's right. Yeah.
He brought in consultants.
That's right. And they didn't do it just with just for a few bucks. They knew exactly what they were doing. They loved what he was doing. They were making a huge amount of money. When he turned the tanks on the Russian parliament, I mean, the Clinton administration was cheering him on. Great, nice, kill the bastards. I mean, they forgot all about democracy and values. Just kill them, kill all those terrible parliamentarians, because they stand in the way of our completely taking over the Russian economy. So yeah, these were Yeltsin's patrons.
In a very interesting way, for me, is that the history of Russia from the waning days of Gorbachev all the way up to like 2000. So we're looking at the 1990s. That script was written by outsiders, and look what happened: utter collapse, despair, and then anger.
Yes.
Okay. I mean, so the law of unintended consequences. Okay. Oh, and let's not forget about the Harvard boys that came to set up the financial markets that profited themselves. I mean, it's such a bankrupt morality. Okay. Right. It's freedom, democracy. Those were not the words in the vocabulary at the time. Everybody.
Right.
Okay.
Right. But again, it's stunning that they were allowed to do it. You think, well, what have you been doing all these years? I mean, surely you'd read Marx. I mean, surely you'd read Lenin. Surely you'd read Stalin. You really think these capitalists, they mean good things for you? Do you really think that they're overflowing with the milk of human kindness, and the West is just here? It's your friend. Hey, good. Let's have a drink. We're all great pals together. I mean, how can anyone believe any such thing? I mean, what have you been doing? I mean,
and the caliber of people, they were dealing with were Hunter Biden's.
Hunter Biden, yeah. What's his name? Browder, Bill Browder. Those are the horrible. Yeah.
Christine Freeland, which lost her mind years ago, but she does have a tome out there, Comrade Criminal, which is actually a very interesting book about the criminalization of the Russian economy and how the West was the supercharger of it.
Right, right. Yeah. Anyway, that was a very...
that was the short answer.
That was the short answer, exactly. We can talk a lot more. So that's Quantum Rome. Then we have a question from Leafy Bug. Says, do you think Ukraine, with its current borders, is a viable nation state over the long term? It seems to me that the Ukrainian nationalists have a vision for their country that the ethnic Russian population within Ukraine will never accept, and vice versa. This problem seems intractable. For years, I've wondered if a peaceful divorce could be negotiated, whereby Russia essentially purchases all Ukrainian territory east of the Dnieper from the government in Kiev. There could be a managed resettlement period whereby those wishing to relocate to the other side of the river could be assisted in doing so. Do you think something like this could be implemented?
Over NATO's dead body.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yeah. Yeah.
Look, I mean, the quandary here, you know, Yats is the guy. Yats is the guy. It goes all the way back there and F the EU, okay? Because Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piat, you know, they were going for the big prize, and they even actually called it, okay? The National Endowment for Democracy, NED, they called it the prize, okay? And they wanted all of it, except for they didn't get all of it. And this is to the heart of the question, because when Lugansk and Donetsk refused to obey what I called at the time official Kiev, because it was a coup regime. And of course, Crimea just said, you know, later days, we're finally out of this place. We've been trying to get out for a long time, and now we're gone. Right. Okay. But because of the unsettledness of the collective, the Donbass, it is to the core of the question. It shows how fragile Ukraine is, because you have a Galician national identity of what Ukraine is, and a Ukrainian. It doesn't apply to the rest of the country. And because they have power in Kiev, they're coercively pushing it onto others. Now, as far as Russia purchasing and things like, no, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen.
I think that's, yeah, and I think it's right. I mean, but I think the point here is I think a very important one, which is that Ukraine was an artificial creation in which bits and pieces of it, of Ukraine, were added by the communist rulers at various times. I mean, and the idea was always to diminish Russia and Russia's role within the USSR. So you get, you know, so therefore a big Ukraine, and with luck, a kind of antagonistic toward Russia, will be bad for Russia. It was a kind of communism pursuing a very cynical divide and rule policy. So they took very large chunks of Russia and just added it onto Ukraine, knowing the Russians would be very resentful of it. And then, of course, they took huge chunks of Poland, Romania, Hungary. So they created this artificial entity, which was okay. I mean, it didn't matter as long as it was in the Soviet Union. But once that Soviet Union dissolved, it was always going to be very problematic keeping this country together. And the stupid Western patrons of Ukraine, who like the Bolsheviks, who wanted to use Ukraine against Russia, didn't really realize that by doing this, by pushing as hard as they did, starting with the Orange Revolution in 2004, they essentially sealed the fate of Ukraine. So up until 2004, they managed to keep that country together. I mean, all those Kuchma and, they kept it together. But once they pushed for that, because the West was not happy with Kuchma, they wanted their man. What's his name? Yushchenko? What was the guy in 2004? Was it Yushchenko?
Yushchenko.
Yeah, Yushchenko. Yeah, the one who claimed also to be a victim of assassination attempt. The first of the people always being claimed that I was poisoned by the Russians. So once
he lived.
Yeah, that's it. Once they did that, and you pushed essentially for a Western, as you said, Galician identity for Ukraine, a Western non-Russian identity, it sealed the fate of Ukraine.
And the Galician Ukrainian identity was invented by the Austrians, folks. Okay, exactly. And that isn't even real.
Right. That's right. Because
that was created as a cudgel against the Russian Empire, because
Russia and against Poland. In other words, it's like because
exactly.
they hated the Poles as well, so they wanted, hey, here are these people. These aren't Poles. These aren't Russians. You know, why don't we create a brand new state?
So the remarkable thing is that, you know, the Ukraine of today is scripted by the West, you know, Russia is reactive all of the time to this, and you know what? It's really interesting. Well, from when the crisis started in 2014 and we had the anti-terrorist operation against the Donbass, you know, in the Western media, it was always, you know, Putin is doing too much in Ukraine. Well, where I sit in Moscow, Russians were saying, Putin isn't doing enough, okay? I mean, it's one of those really interesting stories. We see something completely different, okay? Right. And remember this, if somebody wants to, you know, pull your chain about Ukraine, just use this against them and see how they react. Ukraine, these people in Kiev are pushing a nationalism where there is no nation. Right. And that's why they're having such problems doing it. Right. And the more, and because of the failed Nuland-Piot operation, they expose the fragility. Because, you know, the dilemma for Kiev is really obvious. Why don't they commit to the Minsk I and II Accords? Why won't they? Because once Lugansk or Donetsk gets some kind of special status within Ukraine, and then people in Kharkov are going to say, hey, what about us? Okay, well, maybe we could get some special status. And then the Galicians will say that, and then it all comes tumbling down. And that's why, if you look at WikiLeaks, I don't remember the American ambassador at the time in Moscow, but Lavrov told them, he said, you try to flip Ukraine and you'll destroy the place.
Right, right. No, I think that's right. But I think there's another aspect to it, which is I think that they're probably quite happy to lose.
Yes, option B is acceptable.
Exactly, yes. Because then, you know, there really isn't much of an argument against Ukraine in NATO. I mean, and Ukraine is really pushing for this. I mean, you can't pick up any magazine, you know, National Interest, Foreign Affairs, you know, the Washington Post op-eds, you know, there's always an article. Ukraine is a part of NATO. Ukraine is a part of the EU. We must recognize Ukraine as a key member of the Western Alliance. You know, you remember during that woman, during the Trump impeachment, the first impeachment, you know.
Fiona, or it was Fiona, and then the other one. The other one that's over at Facebook now.
The one who's at the Justice Department now. No, the one she's now at the Justice Department, has a very big position. I think she's number 2 or 3 there. She's at Stanford, a professor at Stanford. So they're fighting Russia over there in order that we don't have to fight Russia over here. And that is.
I think that was the bow tie guy that said it. What the Kent?
George Kent. George Kent. Yes. Bow tie guy. Yeah. He was another one. That's right. But again, it's a measure of the sort of people who populate the U.S. government. So they don't really care. You know, you lose the Donetsk and Lugansk, they don't care. They do want to get, you know, the bigger price for them is to get Ukraine into NATO. Absolute disaster for Ukraine. But that's the price that the Western powers are playing, or at least the United States in particular is playing.
Rules-based order. We come back to that. See, everyone, for a country, at least under the current rules of NATO, a new country can be allowed in if they, one of the conditions is if they don't have border disputes with their neighbors. Well, we got some pretty big border disputes here. And see, what George and I are watching very closely is that these rules-based order guys, are they going to break their own rules? Because they usually do, okay? They very often do, if not always, okay? So will they break their own rules? Okay, that will be very interesting.
Right.
If they do that, and Ukraine becomes a member, the fate of Ukraine is very much up in the air, okay?
Well, I think that's right. I mean, that's one of the things. You're not supposed to have a conflict with a neighbor. You're also not supposed to have an ongoing conflict within your territory. That was the the problem that led Saakashvili to his South Ossetia solution, because a couple of months earlier he'd been promised NATO membership at the Bucharest summit. He said, okay, well, great. Now I have to resolve this problem. I've got the South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So, I mean, that was a classic case of, NATO kind of creating this absolute mess for itself, or for, you know, or largely for Georgians, which is by promising stupidly NATO membership. And that's what was Saakashvili was going to do. Yeah, hey, this is my ticket into NATO. I'll get rid of this, you know, these local conflicts in my country. Ended in complete disaster. Just as the kind of de facto NATO membership within that EU association agreement in 2013 led to the catastrophe in Ukraine. It was a de facto membership of NATO that really triggered the whole thing.
Well, if NATO breaks its own rules, which I'm fully prepared for them to do that, okay, that's what they do. Then there's some options here. Donetsk and Lugansk could declare independence. They could declare it jointly and create a state called the Donbass. They may have a referendum, asked to join Russia. And what will the West do? Well, I mean, the West will do whatever it's going to do, okay? Because then that's the last straw. That's the last straw. The Russians will say, whatever the costs are going to be, okay? Because this is a sovereignty issue for us now, okay?
Right. So, no, I think the Russians will react according to where they see a security threat. They're clearly any kind of NATO membership for them is a red line, and so therefore they will say, okay, boom. I mean, whether it's in their interest to have Donetsk and Lugansk recognize them as an independent state, or whether to incorporate them in Russia, will just simply depend on what they consider to be in their own national security interest.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let's see if there's another question. So a lot of really good questions here. All right, here's a question about a short one about, this is from Denaki, about Orban, and says that, do you think that if Orban is voted out, Visegrad 4 is history in its current sovereignty stance? Is Orban the linchpin to this attitude, so to speak? I think that he has a point there. I mean, I think Orban is really the moving force of the Visegrad 4. I mean, he's really, even though he really doesn't agree with, I mean, for instance, when the Czech Republic got itself into this mess with Russia over the explosion in the Verbice, Orban supported the Czechs, even though he said in an interview that, you know, I just did it because I want to keep Visegrad 4 going.
He's honest.
So, and again, just like, you know, Poland's hostility toward Russia, Orban doesn't share any of that, but to him, it's very important to keep this Visegrad 4 going. And I think he is the moving force of all of this. I mean, I think he's kind of created this idea of Central Europe, the Central European identity. Central Europe is this new avatar of Western civilization. Forget all the stuff in Western Europe. It's Central Europe is the place, and that's why I don't think the others really share his his grandiose vision about Central Europe. So I think he is the linchpin of this. If he loses, and it could happen, as I think we were talking last week, you know, the opposition against him is united. The polls have it very close, and you know, it's happened before. When everybody unites against somebody, then they manage to topple him in the election. So if that happens, I do think that Visegrad 4 may...
And George is going to keep us up to date if they have mail-in voting.
All right, so let's see. So I think one here for you, Peter, is that I'm very close. This is from, also from Denake, and says, so Peter, I'm very curious about the languages you speak. Peter, how did you manage in your day-to-day life in 1980s, 90s Poland? And then he says, I've been to Poland a few times in 2005 to 2008, and while certainly an improvement, they weren't really all that great with English. And then how did you cope in Moscow? Did you learn to speak Polish to a degree? And then he says, and George, you started in life speaking Hungarian, obviously, and then transitioned to English in school. How difficult was it for you to switch to a totally alien language? Did your parents speak English well before moving to Africa and then to England? Did you speak Hungarian at home? And now coming back after all these years, how difficult was it to readjust to speaking Hungarian? Also, do you speak Russian as well? So anyway, all right, there's a lot to get through. So you want to start off?
Well, when I went to Poland, I learned Polish, okay? As simple as that. And I learned it pretty well. I taught university courses in Polish. Russian is different. I mean, I would say I'm proficient in Russian, but I'm not fluent in it. In the 1980s in Poland, being able to speak English really set you apart. You were really, and people like to be set apart, okay? And their contact with foreigners, unlike in the Soviet Union, was a lot easier because the Polonia, the diaspora, is so huge. I mean, it was a joke, each two. How did it go? I mean, basically, I'll rephrase it. If you had an aunt in Chicago, you had a leg up in life, okay? Because the mailing system and people were, and actually Poles could leave and come back, okay? It wasn't easy, but it wasn't like the Soviet Union. And then coming to Russia, I started living here in 1998. No one, I mean, it was very, very few people could speak English, very few. I mean, there would be people that, when I had to get a ticket or something and I have to show my passport, there were people that didn't even recognize the Latin alphabet. I mean, they just like, what's this, okay? They were stunned by it. Now, 2021, yesterday, I was walking my dogs, a little 6-year-old with his parents, he started running towards me, towards the dogs. He said to me in English, "Can I pet your dogs?" I said, "Yeah, sure, go ahead." And then he pet the dogs and he said, "Thank you, sir." And he ran back to his parents, 6-year-old, okay? So they're taking it with a vengeance here. You go to Starbucks, they look at me and they speak instantly English, okay? So young people take it very, very seriously because they're very interested in, unfortunately, in my opinion, in the pop culture, the celebrity stuff and all of that. And so they're very much, the Instagram stuff and all of that. So, English is, and then because we had FIFA here, the World Cup in 2018, the whole city is bilingual. Everything is bilingual. All the signs are in English right underneath where the Russian is. So, I mean, basically what you need to do is you need to learn about 1,500 words and you can survive, okay? It's as simple as that. And basically, I mean, for example, I'll just tell this real quickly. Every year I have to get a medical checkup for my visa. And so RT assigns us a clinic and they say, just say you're from RT. So I go with Kira. Kira is fluent in Russian, very beautiful the way she speaks. And I told her, "Kira, you don't speak Russian when we go to the clinic." And she said, "Why?" And I said, "Just follow my lead." Because you have all these Central Asian migrants, filling out all of the paperwork, and I'm not filling out any paperwork, no way. And so I just show up and say, "RT, RT." And they look at, "Oh, okay, come on," give our passport. Kira and I sit down, they figure out all of the paperwork, and then they escort you around the hospital. Yes, I'm taking full advantage of my status in Russia, okay? But for the most part, people are very, very forthright and friendly. But you have to learn something. I mean, if you don't make any effort at all, you're going to be very alone, okay?
Right,
you have to make an effort.
Just briefly, I mean, about me is that I was born in Hungary, but my first language was Russian because although my father was Hungarian, my mother was Russian, but my father, he came from this famous communist family. He was born in the Soviet Union and he was really part of a kind of the communist elite that was nurtured within the Soviet Union. So we, in a sense, were in Hungary at that time, were kind of known as the Muscovites, the people who arrived to Hungary after World War II and were kind of the communist rulers. So Russian was my language that I spoke at home, and so my Hungarian wasn't. I mean, I was just a small child, and as you said, if you need 1,500 words to get through life as an adult, as a child, you need probably about 500 words to get through. I mean, you know, and so I think that's probably what I had in Hungarian.
A lot of pointing.
Yeah, exactly. And then so when we left, and I never spoke Hungarian at home, and I never spoke, obviously, when living in England, Hungarian with anyone in England, my Hungarian got pretty rusty. And so coming back to Hungary wasn't really that easy, because Hungarian, as everybody knows, is an extremely difficult language. It's a kind of sui generis. It doesn't resemble any language, so it's very hard to learn it. It's not at all a Slavic language. It's not a Germanic language. So
it's Hungarian.
Exactly. It's not a Romance language. So it is extremely hard. And unfortunately, the Hungarians, unlike the Russians, they're not quite as diligent about learning foreign language. I think they feel very arrogant. You know, we've got this beautiful language. No one else in the world can speak it. And they feel pretty pleased with themselves. And so, for instance, you watch television, everything is dubbed into Hungarian. You know, you can't watch an American movie unless it's sort of dubbed into Hungarian. So, you know, you watch Brad Pitt speaking Hungarian. I mean, everything is like, they don't even want to, you know, read the subtitles or to help them learn English. So I think that's, you know, it's not easy to get by in this country if you don't know any Hungarian. I mean, you know, foreigners, you know, they usually hang out among themselves. But it really is not that easy to.
I studied Hungarian. I went for a semester. I guess it was in '93, and you know, it was called Karl Marx University at the time.
Right. It's Corvinus. It's called Corvinus. I mean, that's what it used to be. The historic name Corvinus is reverted back to its old name, Corvinus. Very near, actually. But you go.
And because the university likes the exchange students because they make a little bit of money, all you had to do is basically show up and you passed, okay? Right. And that was my angle, okay? I mean, I learned, whatever I learned, I forgot very, very quickly. I mean, ega shega dre, you know, that's like cheers, you know? Exactly. Sure, that's beer, right?
Yeah. Sure, that's a sure.
Sure. Yeah. Okay, I mean, you could see what I was learning there.
Sure, bore, wine, and you're good to go.
And then George is spot on, is that there were these watering holes, and it would be foreigners, and it would be young Hungarian girls that wanted to meet foreigners. So that was the whole thing, okay? Yeah. So it's quite impenetrable. Because I learned Polish, I studied Russian, I studied Polish, I studied Czech. And, you know, and I made different levels of progress, but when I got to Hungary, it was a brick wall. It was like, as long as I could order a beer.
It is, exactly. That's, you know, that's right, for sure. But I think it's also just interesting. I mean, you talked about this Russian little boy who's learned English. But here, I think that they're very arrogant about their language. I think they know, hey, we know this language. It's a unique language. They're convinced also that it's such an esoteric language that you have to be really, really brainy to master it, and say, well, the reason why we have so many mathematicians who are Hungarians is we have this really difficult language, and if you master this language, you have to be good at math. Of course, it's utter nonsense, but that's how they convince themselves. So they said, why should we learn another language? You know, we're good with the language we've got. So
I learned English when you can play chess.
That's it. I mean, you know, they have a lot of very smart people, a lot of very, very good chess players, a lot of very good mathematicians. Hungarians have always been very good at mathematics. I don't think it has much to do.
Well, I have a question for you, George. I mean, I should know this, but I don't remember. I mean, how much did the Hungarian elite, Magyar elite, know German during the dual monarchy?
I don't think they knew very much. They didn't know very much. What they did was they rammed Hungarian down on all the non-Hungarians who were living in Hungary. It made the Hungarians a very unpopular people in Europe because they thought, hey, you know, you're forcing them to learn this language, which why should, I mean, it's one thing to force people to learn German.
I can only talk to you.
All of the Slavs who were living there, you know, the Romanians and Serbs, or whatever, they were all being forced to learn Hungarian. So it was the modularization policy, you know, all the sort of English liberals would absolutely condemn the Hungarians. You know, these are terrible, horrible people. You know, ramming this Hungarian town,
like the Ukrainians doing to the Russian speakers.
Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Oh, well, Peter, that was that's our mailbag for today. Time goes by very quickly when we're dealing with these questions. So we've got a lot more letters. Yeah. Listen, we have plenty more to chew on next time.
All right, everybody, we're on Locals, so go to thegaggle.locals.com. George and I do one-on-one Zoom chats. We're going to do one in a few minutes. We have the Gaggle store up. Buddy is highly profiled. He's talking to me about IP issues already. Okay, we just did a Q&A here. George did his first live stream. I'm going to premiere this week. Okay, and that last thing, George.
The last thing is the tip jar, which Buddy has licked dry even as we were speaking, and so it needs replenishment. Otherwise, unlike Buddy, Peter and I will go hungry, and we don't want to be there. So anything that you can contribute to the tip jar would be most appreciated. So
tip jar.
We love your generosity. You've been very helpful to us, but please keep it up. We don't have George Soros knocking on our door and offering. Oh, look at that! Yeah, he's obviously had his more than his fair share. So remember, if you like the Gaggle, please like, share, and subscribe. See you soon. Bye.